Hi, everybody. Welcome back to Patriots History. I'm co-author of Patriots History of the United States with Michael Allen and your host for the show. As always, I am working from the 15th anniversary edition of Patriots History of the United States. Some of the headers will be different, but not too many. The page numbers will be different if you have earlier editions, though. So you might have to poke around a little bit to find out exactly where we are. We are in Chapter 7. We just finished Mr. Polk's War, about the Mexican War. Let me review a little bit before we continue on to westward again. The expansion of the United States was always influenced by, tainted by, accelerated by, whatever phrase you want to use. It was influenced by the issue of slavery. Were the new territories going to be free or slave territories? This is what they wanted to know. How does this work out in that grand design that Martin Van Buren concocted in the 1820s for avoiding a civil war, maintaining the balance of the North and South, keeping the discussion of slavery out of all national legislative debates, that kind of stuff. And so we saw that when Texas came up to be incorporated in the U.S. through a treaty of annexation, everybody knew it would be slave territory. So David Wilmot, the Pennsylvania congressman, introduced this proviso, the Wilmot Proviso, that said there would be no slavery in any of the territories taken by the United States in the Mexican War. That would include New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, Nevada, California. A lot of territory. And as we saw last time, this didn't get anywhere. But again, the point I keep trying to make to you is that instead of dealing with slavery early on, taking the hit, as they say, bearing the uncomfortable of doing away with slavery early on, they kept trying to shut it up as an issue, trying to hush it up, trying to bottle it up, trying to keep it from coming into the national debate. And we will see again and again through compromises, whether it's a Missouri Compromise or two that we haven't gotten to yet, the Compromise of 1850 or the Kansas-Nebraska Act. They keep trying to find a way to let slavery exist and just kind of keep on going. And as I mentioned before, this was always impossible. This is why the book Freedom National by James Oakes is such an important book, because it was always going to be impossible. Sooner or later, you were going to have to decide what a slave was. Is a slave a person? If so, don't persons have rights that all men are given by God? Life, liberty, pursuit of happiness. Is a slave a piece of property, chattel, like a cow or a chair, with no rights? Because ultimately that's what it had to come from. Now, I understand in the South there were laws prohibiting killing a slave outright. Some states had laws on mistreating a slave, but by and large, there were very few protections of any kind of human rights within the Southern slavery system. Very few. A couple of states like Maryland and Missouri, a slave could sue for wrongful imprisonment as a slave when they were really free. This is, of course, how the Dred Scott case came to be. But sooner or later, you are going to have this fight over what is a slave. If they're people, don't they have rights just like white people do, just like everybody else? If they're not people, then shouldn't anybody be able to take a slave into the North? Why do we even have provisions in state constitutions or state laws prohibiting slaves from coming in? These are very, very important debates and arguments that should have been held at the very latest around 1808 to 1810. But they, as we say, kick the can down the road all the time, leaving it for somebody else to deal with. And of course, the longer a problem builds up, it's like a disease. If you're sick and you wait too long to go get medical help, the problem can become far, far worse than it ever was in the first place. And that's what happens with slavery. It becomes so entrenched in the South that they can't get rid of it. And the only way to protect it is to expand slavery further into the territories, i.e. Texas, and then actual territories. Texas, of course, comes in as an independent republic, and spread it all throughout the United States. It's the only alternative. Lincoln was absolutely right. You can't have a house divided. It will either, he didn't say it would fall. He said we become either all slave or all free. All right, so we are moving on now. On page 260, westward again. Beneath the simmering political cauldron of pro and anti-slavery strife, pioneers continued to surge west. Explorers and trappers were soon joined in the 1830s by a relatively new group, religious missionaries. Second Great Awakening enthusiasm propelled Methodists, led by the Reverend Jason Lee, to Oregon in 1832 to establish a mission to the Chinook Indians. Elijah White, then Marcus Whitman, and his pregnant wife Narcissa followed later, bringing along some 1,000 migrants and measles to the region. White and Lee soon squabbled over methods. Eventually, the Methodist Board concluded that it could not Christianize the Indians, and dried up the funding for the Methodist missions. The Whitmans are even more unfortunate. After measles spread among the Cayuse Indians, they blamed the missionaries and murdered the Whitmans at their Walla Walla mission. Such brutality failed to stem the missionary zeal toward the new Western territories, however, and a number of Jesuit priests, most notably Father Pierre Desmay, established 6 successful missions in the northern Rocky Mountains of Montana, Idaho, and Washington. Pioneer farmer immigrants followed the missionaries into Oregon, where the population rose from 50 to more than 6,000 whites between 1839 and 1846. They traveled the Oregon Trail from Independence, Missouri, along the southern bank of the Platte River, across Wyoming and southern Idaho, and finally to Fort Vancouver on the Columbia River. Oregon Trail pioneers encountered hardships, including rainstorms, snow and ice, treacherous rivers, steep mountain passes, and wild animals. I remember there once, in the early days of video gaming, was a video game called the Oregon Trail. Another group of immigrants, the Mormons, trekked their way to Utah along the northern bank of the Platte River under the leadership of Brigham Young. They arrived at the Great Salt Lake just as the Mexican War broke out. Tens of thousands of their brethren joined them during the following decades. The Mormon Trail attracted many California-based settlers and soon gold miners. Discovery of gold at Sutter's Mill near Sacramento in 1848 brought hordes of miners, prospectors, and speculators, virtually all of them men, and many attracted to the seamier side of the social order. Any number of famous Americans spent time in California gold camps, including Mark Twain and Richard Henry Dana, both of whom wrote notable essays on their experiences. But for every Twain or Dana who made it to California and left, and for every prospector who actually discovered gold, There were perhaps 100 who went away broke, many of them who had abandoned their families and farms to seek the precious metal. Nevertheless, the amount of gold found in California hills was spectacular, perhaps 650 million by 1860. With gold soon came banks, including the famous Wells Fargo. Even after gold played out, by the way, the money of California in this early time was gold certificates. You had a note that entitled you to a certain amount of gold. Nevertheless, the amount of gold found in California hills was spectacular. 650 million. With the gold soon came banks, including the famous Wells Fargo. Even after the gold played out, there was no stopping the population wave as some discovered the natural beauty and freedom offered by the West and stayed. San Francisco swelled from 1,000 souls in 1856 to 50,000 by the decade's end, whereas in parts of Arizona and Colorado, gold booms and discoveries of other metals could produce an overnight metropolis and just as quickly a ghost town. And we would see these towns like Tombstone appear, Wilcox, and other such places. And they would boom for a while with the discovery of gold or silver, and then when it played out, they would just almost disappear. Mostly tourist traps today. The Pacific coast was largely sealed off from the rest of the country by the Great Plains and the Rocky Mountains. Travel to California was best done by boat from ports along the Atlantic to Panama, then overland, then on another boat up the coast. Crossing overland directly from Missouri was dangerous and expensive. This is where Cornelius Vanderbilt got a real fortune. He provided a packet steamer from Panama up to San Francisco, really. And he charged a fraction of what the existing steamer companies charged. And they tried everything. They tried to buy him out, and he wouldn't sell at first. Then they tried to outcompete him, and they couldn't. And then finally, after he had lowered prices 80% or more, they finally managed to convince him to take the money and run. And they bought him out, but they found that once he had lowered the prices that much, they could never again raise the prices back to where they were before. They did raise them some. They about doubled it from the level they were at when he left, which was still more than half the cost of what it was before then. So Vanderbilt did Americans a huge favor by stepping into that business. St. Joseph, Missouri, the jumping off point for the overland travel, provided plenty of reputable stables and outfitters, but it was also home to dens of thieves and speculators who preyed on unsuspecting pioneers. Thousands of travelers poured into St. Joseph, then on across the overland trail to Oregon on a 2,000-mile trek that could take 6 months. Up to 5,000 per year followed in the trail in the 1840s, which some 2,700 continued on to California. By 1850, after the discovery of gold, more than 55,000 pioneers crossed the desert a year. Now, usually these people came in wagon trains, the idea being that individual wagons were too easily knocked off by Indians, and so you would travel with groups of other pioneers, and should Indians attack, you just formed your wagons into a circle, and it was very difficult for the Indians to overcome these wagon trains if they had enough wagons in them and enough rifles. So they pretty much stuck to kind of picking off loners. By the way, one study I read many, many years ago suggested that in all the Indian wars, the kill ratio was 60-1 in favor of the Indians, largely because of so many of these individual wagons or small groups of wagons that went out and were annihilated. So it kind of gives a different perspective on the old whites, annihilating the Indians story. In 7 years from 1849 to 1856, let's see. Let's go back up. In 1850, after the discovery of gold, more than 55,000 pioneers crossed the desert a year. Perhaps another 1,000 traders frequented the Santa Fe Trail. That one came down out of St. Joseph through Santa Fe, New Mexico, down through modern-day Tucson. Phoenix didn't really exist at the time, but up through what is now Phoenix into San Diego and then up the coast. It was flatter, and it didn't have nearly as many Indians, and it didn't have, obviously, the weather. Santa Fe could get dicey in winter, but that's about it. But it was much longer. Many 49ers preferred the water route. San Francisco, the supply depot for Sacramento, overnight became a thriving city. In 7 years, from 1849 to 56, excuse me, the city's population filled with merchants, artisans, shopkeepers, bankers, lawyers, saloon owners, and traders. Access to the Pacific Ocean facilitated trade from around the world, giving the town international and multi-ethnic character. Saloons and gambling dens dotted the cityscape, enabling gangs and brigands to disrupt peaceful commerce. With the addition and slow settlement of California, the Pacific Northwest, and relatively unexplored American Southwest, Americans east of the Mississippi again turned their attention inward. After all, the objective of stretching the United States from sea to shining sea had been met. Only the most radical and unrealistic expansionists desired annexation of Mexico, so further movement southward was blocked. In the 1850s, there would be talk of acquiring Cuba, but the concept of manifest destiny had crested. Moreover, the elephant in the room could no longer be ignored. In the years that followed, from 1848 to 1860, slavery dominated almost every aspect of American politics in one form or another. So, I know it's short today, but we're going to stop there because the next thing is chapter 8, the house dividing, and you know, it's just a whole separate topic when we get to the whole issue of slavery and how America came to separate over the issue of slavery. If you're interested, there's a pretty good show, a little depressing, 1883 on Paramount, which is the precursor to the very big hit series Yellowstone. And I recommend that only because it's a very good interpretation of this whole wagon train process with immigrants who don't know how to drive horses, who don't know how to fire rifles. I mean, we take it for granted because we're Americans, and almost everybody at that time knew how to fire a weapon and knew how to, you know, make fires and just do all the prairie kind of stuff. But that wasn't the case. And so in the series 1883, Sam Elliott leads a group of Germans who don't speak any English. When they start with about 50 or so wagons, which is, I'd say, the minimum you would want to have to cross the plains. So that's maybe 200 people. And they have one problem after another, including a huge tornado that comes through and just takes out most of the wagon train. And the 8 or 10 wagons that are left, they bicker about who's going to go forward and who's going to stay and all this kind of stuff. And they end up splitting up. And of course, they get picked off when they're smaller. Like I said, it's very depressing, but it is quite accurate in terms of what often happened, especially to a smaller wagon train. That's why usually they would wait in St. Louis until crossing time, the summer. A lot easier to cross in the summer than the winter, and or early spring, as soon as the rain stopped and the mud wasn't there anymore. And they'd put together wagon trains of 200 or 300 wagons because it just There were too many variables to go with many fewer than that. And they learned to build what was called the Conestoga wagon, which was an exceptionally large wagon. And if you caulked it correctly, it could float across a river. Now, it's not going to, cross a raging rapids, but if the river is fairly calm, you could float your Conestoga wagon across the river. So anyway, that's a pretty good one. Thinking if there's any other that really matches up to that. I don't think so. I think that's probably the best example of a wagon train. And they leave from Texas. They don't leave from St. Joseph, but nevertheless. Okay. So next time we will start really getting into the Civil War, the 1850s, and the division of the country over slavery. And remember, Patriot's History of Globalism is going to be out February 20th. And you can advance order it right now. I have completed the 20th anniversary edition of Patriot's History of the United States. I think we will make this a freebie if you buy Wild World of History VIP, or if you buy the Wild World of Politics Insider. Eventually, I will put it up free for everybody. But if you want it right away for the next few months to get ready for homeschooling this year, you might want to consider getting the History VIP. It contains 40 or 50 hours of video lessons by me on everything from the Crusades to Prohibition to Hitler to Napoleon to World War II in the Pacific, on and on and on. And then it's got 7 ongoing lesson programs, including my latest, which is Integrity, Winston Churchill. And as soon as I'm finished with this, I'm going to record the next episode of Churchill. So consider the VIP. It's only $5 a month, and what you get is just incredible. And of course, we will be adding in the Patriots History 20th Anniversary Edition, which will consist of a PDF of the new chapter and all of the changes and insertions I made all the way through. All right. I will see you back here next time.